Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching The Fall of the Byzantine Empire, history summarized by Overly Sarcastic Productions. This is the third and final part of Overly Sarcastic Productions' series on the Byzantine Empire. We have witnessed the rise of the Byzantine Empire, its golden age, and now we're heading to the fall. But before we get into that, I would appreciate it if you guys would check out my Patreon. It is linked down below, and it will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this video.
While the Roman Empire in the West was getting goth-smacked into oblivion in 476 AD, the eastern half of the empire, with its capital of Constantinople, was, by comparison, doing pretty great.
By comparison, it had its own fair share of struggles, but by comparison to the West, yes, the East was doing a whole lot better. And you know, we started this series basically with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, what most people refer to as the fall of Rome. And we are ending with the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire. How about that?
For one, they existed, so that's a plus.
Yeah.
And the Byzantine Empire evolved into a gorgeous gold-coated hybrid of classical Greco-Roman and medieval Christian culture. But unfortunately for our biz boys, shiny mosaics and ginormous domes couldn't prevent the infinite abyss of disasters that lay in wait over the millennium to come.
Look, yeah. So the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, because that's what it was, had to adapt and evolve over time. It was entering into a new world. It was no longer the single, unquestioned empire of the region. It couldn't be, but it evolved into a very important regional power. At times, perhaps the or one of the most important and powerful empires in the world. At times, a little less important. It depends at which point you look. But basically, the Byzantine Empire became very influential, very culturally influential in its art, its architecture, its religion, its trade, all of these things. It made an impact on the world. But nothing can last forever, and like we said, it faced its fair share of challenges while the West was falling, and it continued to face a barrage of challenges throughout the next millennium. Eventually, it would be brought to its knees, it would fall, but it did manage to last a remarkably long amount of time dealing with a lot of these issues.
Between Persians, Goths, Arabs, Turks, Normans, and the more than occasional civil war, it's safe to say that the Byzantines could not catch a break. And the latter medieval period continues this distinctly Promethean trend, where they suffer a constant and arduous evisceration by eagle without ever actually dying from it.
Yes.
As we will indeed see in just a moment, our favorite golden disaster empire managed to keep on thriving and defying the
Yeah, they do continue to shrink. You know, in that first episode, we saw the Byzantine Empire under Justinian. Justinian actually managed to reclaim some of the western provinces, so the Byzantine Empire under Justinian almost looks like just a shrunk down version of the United Roman Empire. It has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller over time. Now, there have been points where the Byzantine Empire has expanded, claimed more territory. Usually that leads to trouble because it can't actually administer that new territory, but the general trend over this time period has been shrinkage. It's been getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and you can see what we're dealing with now.
specter of death despite even the most garbage of circumstances. So, to see how the Byzantine Empire procrastinated its own death and even then kind of slipped past the deadline, let's do some history. Now, this video's timeline will start, incidentally, with the fall of the empire, about 2 centuries ahead of the typical 1453. I know, we're making great time. Because
Interesting.
long before the Ottomans ever entered the picture, the Byzantines were struggling to coexist with the Italian merchant empires they were growing so reliant on. Venetian and Genoese traders tussled.
Yeah, this is very true. You know, in the end, it is the Ottomans that truly bring the Byzantine Empire down. You know, they conquer its territory, they take Constantinople, but even before the ambitious and aggressive Ottomans arrived on the scene with their quickly expanding empire, the Byzantines were having a hard enough time coexisting with, you know, their brothers under Christ from the West, the Latin Christians, the Catholics, the Western Christians, whatever you want to call this other group. Technically, we're talking about Christians and Orthodox Christians, but they did not always get along. In fact, a lot of the time, they didn't get along at all. the Byzantines were having a difficult time dealing with some of these Italians and Normans, etc., these Latin Western Christians, right? They were causing a lot of trouble for the Byzantines.
In the Latin neighborhoods of Constantinople like they were street gangs in Shakespearean Verona, but the Byzantines poured the proverbial Greek fire on the problem by arresting and then murdering tens of thousands of Latin citizens in the city.
Yes, Latins is probably a good way to refer to them, and as they pointed out, Constantinople at this point had quarters for a lot of these different Italian traders, because these Italian city-states were getting pretty wealthy at this point off of all these trade deals. And if we think about our timeline, we're sort of slowly heading towards an era of more prosperity for the region, the Renaissance. All these trade deals start to build up. And so Constantinople has quarters for these traders, but, sometimes that can cause issues. When you have basically these interest groups stationed in Constantinople, you can imagine how problems can emerge.
Bad look. This giant yikes was compounded by the baffling ineptitude of the ruling Angelus dynasty, whose constant infighting left the empire woefully mismanaged. This got infinitely worse when the powers of Europe launched Crusade numero 4 on the promise of, this time it might actually work, to the ensuing
And as we saw, the First Crusade, it was basically requested by the Byzantine Empire. It didn't end up playing out how the Byzantines had expected, but they had still managed to benefit from it, though it did put them in a very vulnerable position. These armies of Latin Christians marching through their territory, and there was a lot of tension there. The First Crusade basically ended up working out for the Byzantine Empire. This is not true for some of these other crusades, as we're about to see.
Prize of precisely nobody, it got off to a rocky start, with their understaffed army getting excommunicated by the Pope before they even left the Adriatic Sea.
Damn.
But the light at the end of the Crusaders' tunnel was Prince Alexios Angelos, who offered Byzantine military support in exchange for reinstating his deposed father. So here we see the Angeloi ignoring the key rules from Alexios Komnenos' declassified crusading survival guide. Rule 1. Under any circumstances, do not ask crusaders for help. We've been through this before.
Exactly. And really, this is, to be honest with you, I kind of think the only reason that the Eastern Roman Empire made it through that First Crusade unscathed and even gaining some territory was because of Alexios Komnenos. He very intelligently, very skillfully was able to handle these crusaders, make deals with them, negotiate with them, and he was able to shepherd them through his territory without them causing too much harm, and send them on their way to the Holy Land, and actually pick up some Byzantine territory in the process. Without someone as brilliant as Alexios Komnenos in charge, well, I think things sort of start to fall apart. And, we're seeing that here, not even following sort of the rule book, the guidebook left behind by Alexios Komnenos.
It is not worth it. Rule 2. If the Crusaders arrive anyway, transport your Crusaders across your empire as fast as humanly possible. Do not let them get any ideas.
That is key.
Rule 3.
Keep them
While
moving.
Your Crusaders are inside your empire, never under any circumstances.
This is so true, and this is exactly what Alexios Komnenos did. He tried to keep them moving as quickly as possible. Now, there were some holdups while they were stationed around his empire, especially around Constantinople. Alexios Komnenos kept those crusaders happy to the best of his ability without giving away his empire to them. Cash prizes, titles, all this sort of stuff. Keep them happy. Even if it's sort of surface level, do what you can until you can get them moving again and get them out of your empire.
Circumstances provoke your Crusaders. They are armed, violent, and prone to fits of disproportionate rage. Yet, in 1204, the Angeloi failed spectacularly on every point.
Yeah.
And, spying an opportunity to quit while they were ahead, the Crusaders simply sacked Constantinople.
Yep.
Venice deliberately instigated the pillaging, but by this point the Byzantines really should have known better than to tee them up. So, the sack. Beyond being
Let's get into it. This was, by the way, a truly disastrous moment in Byzantine history. The sack itself, awful, truly awful. And, when we talk about sort of late Byzantine history, this is one of the worst points of that late Byzantine history. And as we've seen, the empire has been in decline for a long time before this. But this makes things a whole lot worse.
A rough approximation of literal hell on earth for the Byzantines unfortunate enough to be on the receiving end, the Crusaders desolated the art and architecture of the city. Venetians had the good sense to steal the priceless relics of Constantinople for the glory of the Republic, instead of mindlessly burning and or murdering everything and or one. But whether trashed or taken, Constantinople still ended up ruined, and the rest of the empire was next on the to thieve list.
Yep.
Venice, the crafty little devils, chose to swipe up the islands of the Aegean, while the Franks installed a Latin emperor on the Byzantine throne and carved up the Greek mainland. On paper, the Byzantine Empire ends right here.
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting point to make. We talk about the Byzantine Empire falling, perhaps with the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans. It did continue to exist in one form or another, but... And the way people put it is that it never really recovered from the sack of Constantinople, which I think is accurate. It truly never recovered. It was never the same. They're making the argument that it ended right here. That is sort of an abnormal argument. I'm not entirely sure if, I'm not necessarily saying it's false. It's an interesting argument to make. It's not a commonly accepted point. But what is commonly accepted is that the empire truly entered terminal decline after the sack of Constantinople, and it never returned to what it was previously.
The capital was now kaput, and the Aegean basin, which so long preserved the Greco-Roman world, went poof. But even the end of the empire couldn't shake that damn Hellenic persistence, as Byzantine nobles in survival mode quickly
This is what, when I say it survived in one way or another, even past this point, and so... we still call this the Byzantine Empire. We still say it has about 200 years left.
Without successor states in the wake of the Crusade, in Trebizond, Nicaea, and Epirus. Each became a haven for Greeks fleeing their new Frankish overlords in mainland Greece, whose Latin empire proved to be little more than a post-Crusade money pot. But the Franks quickly got bored by the prospect of actually governing and soon became weaker than the assorted Byzantines they had so recently stomped.
Yep.
Are we really surprised? The three Hellenic states started out on the defensive, to put it mildly, but some shifty strategy and good old-fashioned luck gave Nicaea a leg up. After spreading out over the western Anatolian coast and gaining a foothold in Thrace and Macedonia, the Nicaeans reconquered Constantinople kind of by accident. Well,
there you go. We have some sort of Byzantine Empire again. It's returned!
a small army scouted around the city to suss out its defenses. They learned that the Frankish army was out on campaign. So the Byzantines snuck through a small break in the wall, opened a gate, and then took the city.
Brilliant.
For all of the disasters to befall the Byzantines, it's only fair that the RNG just this once works out in their favor. Though Emperor Michael Palaiologos soon found his work cut out for him, as the city had hardly been cleaned since the Crusade half a century earlier, and
Yeah, I think found his work cut out for him is the understatement of the century. I mean, we could think about how bad a position the Byzantine Empire was in even before the sack of Constantinople. It was sort of in decline. It was really struggling to defend its own territory. It was having some issues with its neighbors from several different directions. After this, my goodness, it is in a truly terrible state. A extremely difficult state to recover from.
Being so close to death's door prevented the Byzantines from cutting quite as imperial a figure as they used to. Still, it was better than the alternative. As we've seen, it was hard enough to defend the Byzantine dominion back in the good old days, but with the emperor now presiding over a kingdom and a capital that were both hollow shells of their former selves, clever diplomacy was the sharpest weapon in the arsenal. Fair to say the more impressive achievement was not in retaking Constantinople.
Yeah, and we'd already seen the Byzantines moving towards this. I mean, look at the First Crusade, for example. Now, the whole reason Alexios Komnenos had asked the church for help, now maybe he didn't expect it to end up in a crusade, but the reason he had asked for help was because he knew he didn't have the manpower and resources to retake his lost territory. And so he tried to do it through a bit of careful diplomacy. So the Byzantines have already been moving away from really exerting themselves through manpower, through military, as it traditionally might have, and has been moving far more towards diplomacy and negotiation. Diplomacy has always been a big part of the Byzantine Empire, and oftentimes diplomacy just means paying people off, just giving them a lot of money. But as we get later and later in Byzantine history, not only is diplomacy a big part of how it survives, it sort of becomes the key part, because the empire really struggles to exert itself militarily.
but in keeping it. As ever, the rivalry between Venice and Genoa made this difficult, as their schoolyard slap fight had a conspicuous habit of always going down in Constantinople.
Yeah.
And, of course, there were a few strategic flubs, such as when the Byzantines hired a band of Catalan mercenaries who went rogue at the slightest provocation and claimed the Duchy of Athens for the next 7 decades.
Jesus.
But even this wasn't the worst mercenary customer experience the Byzantines would endure, as in 1343, the royal treasury was too thin to pay for Venetian help, so the former Empress Anna pawned what she had, which was the empire's crown jewels. So, despite selling Constantinople's royal honor for some warships, Anna lost her war, which, I should say, was a civil war against the empire.
Oh, classic Roman moment. You know, the Venetians were really causing a lot of issues at this point, but clearly the Byzantines were causing some issues for themselves. But the tricky little Venetian Republic getting in there, taking all these trade deals, benefiting from a lot of the chaos and warfare that was occurring around the eastern Mediterranean at this point. Like I said, when we look at the timeline, some of these Italian city-states, Venice is a great example. They mentioned Genoa as well. They're getting pretty damn rich at this point, and they're beginning to devote themselves to other pursuits now that they have all this prosperity. So we're sort of seeing this process occurring in real time.
So, when acting Emperor John Cantacuzene and his wife Irene were officially coronated in 1347, the crowns were copies made of tinted glass, because the originals were off in Venice, like every other Byzantine artifact.
And we talked about earlier in this series, a lot of the best examples of Byzantine architecture are actually in Italy, some of them in Venice, but in different cities in Italy, because that's where a lot of the Byzantine architecture survived. As we might see near the end of this video, a lot of the Byzantine architecture within the empire, within Constantinople, was done away with in one way or another, or perhaps, repurposed and changed immeasurably, right? So it's interesting, not only does Italy have some of the best example of this style of architecture, but now they've got all the artifacts, they've got the crown, they've got everything. These Italian city-states are taking everything from the Byzantine Empire.
Yet, somehow, despite all that, hardly the worst thing to happen in the 1340s, because, as we know, plague. Man, does not let up. Population is ravaged, economy in ruins, let us not dally here, friends, we all know the drill, and this would provide a golden opportunity for the Ottomans over in Anatolia.
Oh, here we go. And like I said, the ambitious, aggressive, and expansionist Ottomans. Another truly fascinating empire. We haven't really talked about the Ottomans that much on this channel, but I find the Ottoman Empire very interesting. But here we have it, and it will begin to expand quickly. As you will see, it first expands sort of around Constantinople. It shows you how strong the city is, even at this point, even really at its lowest.
The next big Muslim power. So, about a century after the reconquest of Constantinople, there were 4 fundamental and unavoidable problems to the empire's long-term health. The Ottomans were gaining strength and pushing west. Venice and Genoa turned the Aegean into their personal...
Yeah, and at this point, the empire's done for. So we've seen its territory be eaten away by Normans and Venetians and Genoa, etc., etc., but now we have this Muslim empire from the east, and the Byzantine Empire's dealt with these before, right? It dealt with the Caliphate, the Seljuk Turks. Now, it really struggled against those empires, but it did manage to survive. Now we have the Ottomans, who, have gone from east to west. They've taken, Anatolia at this point, or at least most of Anatolia, and they've hopped right over to Europe, and they've now taken a good chunk and will take, basically all of the Byzantine-controlled Balkans. So now the Ottomans have you surrounded on both sides, and they control a good chunk of the territory that you once administered. This is truly a threat that the Byzantines have not faced before. I mean, they have faced a lot of serious threats. The empire at certain points has looked like it wouldn't recover, but at this point it truly cannot recover. Unless the Ottomans were to completely implode, which they don't, of course.
Battlefield, and the complete lack of a Byzantine economy meant they were fully dependent on those two for trade. Then, to cap it off, we've got the endless internal power struggles and succession crisis.
By the way, this is a really interesting point that sort of goes beyond the Byzantine Empire. There's an ever-shifting balance of whether Constantinople is at the center of the world, the edge of it, or the wrestling pit for everybody else. This is fascinating because in many ways Constantinople is the center, right? It's sort of the connection point for, East and West, whatever you want to talk about East and West as. It is in many ways sort of a meeting point for Christian civilization and Muslim civilization. It is the meeting point of Europe and Asia and Africa to a certain extent. You head into the Middle East, which is the meeting point of all these civilizations. If you want to talk about trade from the East, a lot of that passes through Constantinople on its way to Europe. So it really is this center point, but it's also at the edge. In terms of Europe, it's at the edge of Europe. In terms of the Middle East, it's at the edge. If you want to talk about sort of Asia more broadly, well, it's at the edge of that, So it really is this fascinating place in a fascinating position.
Crises. Let's not kid ourselves, this is still the Romans we're talking about here. With worries like that, fully rebuilding the empire was a no-go, so the Byzantines picked their battles and bought their time, which meant putting themselves under the protection of the Ottomans. But, ever defiant in the face of peril, giving up was never an option. While
Oh no, come on. And look, we now at this point may be very detached from the United Roman Empire of old, the Empire of Augustus, or even the empire, of much later, but these are still Romans. Giving up ain't an option. They will adapt. They will keep going until they literally can't. They'll keep fighting.
Empire was shrinking down to just Constantinople, things looked shockingly different on the other side of the Aegean. Right when Michael Palaiologos was tripping ass first into retaking Constantinople in 1261, he also had the good fortune of capturing the Latin prince of Achaia in a battle, and ransomed him back in exchange for a few castles down in the Peloponnese. They weren't much, but they were well fortified among the mountains, much like the ancient Spartans had been way back when. Over the next 2 centuries, this distant Byzantine outpost in Laconia became a prosperous corner of the Hellenic world, as Greeks from the Morea and beyond flocked into the city of Mistra to try.
Yeah, and we often, at this point, when we're talking about the Byzantine Empire, we exclusively talk about Constantinople, but I think what some people forget is that there were other outposts of Byzantine authority. Very rare, but it wasn't just Constantinople.
Try and pick up where the empire left off. So in the 13 and 1400s, Mistras became a haven of Byzantine culture and scholarship. And I mean, look,
And that's a good way to put it, a haven, right? Because when your territory is being eaten up by all these different peoples and empires, well, a lot of these people are going to flee to these territories and bring their Byzantine culture and art and religion. So haven is a good word for it.
I'm not gonna pretend like one decently well-off corner of the Greek world is just on par with the empire pre-Crusade, because of course it's not.
No.
But I will come to bat for the Morea as a paragon of that Romano-Hellenic perseverance, to keep on trying even after everything seemed lost. No, I'm not getting sentimental, that's just Marvel.
It's interesting, we're really talking in a more Hellenistic way now, Hellenic, aka Greek, right? And I am a believer that the Byzantine Empire was an extension of the Roman Empire. It was the Eastern Roman Empire, but it is true that, especially as we get closer to the fall of the empire, a lot of this is very identifiably Greek. And they said, Romano-Hellenistic, Romano-Greek. That makes sense. Well, a lot of these Greek states were part of the Roman Empire. But it's just interesting to see a lot of that culture now be identified as sort of Greek culture, and we can sort of link it to modern-day Greek populations. It's sort of interesting.
Dust in my eyes. Shut up. Anyway, like with Constantinople, keeping this territory safe required a gentle diplomatic touch, but the game was a hell of a lot easier with water on 3 sides and mountains on the 4th. And with Constantinople sweating javelins at the sight of incoming Ottomans, it became clear that the Morea could handle itself, so it gained autonomy in 1349. By the early 1400s, they expanded outside Laconia into almost the entire Peloponnese and briefly had authority over Attica. The Byzantine Morea also had...
And we talk about the connection to sort of the modern-day Greek population. We look at Morea here, it is occupying, sort of modern-day Greek territory, you know what I mean? Also, you could link it back to sort of the ancient Grecian states, so just some interesting connections there.
a practical benefit to Constantinople, as emperors in waiting got their political training as governors down in the Peloponnese, to the point where the last emperor, Constantine XI, was actually crowned in Mistras rather than up in the capital.
Wow.
Uh-oh. Did I say last? Yeah,
Uh-oh.
about that. The thing with the Ottomans is they didn't stop, despite the empire's best efforts.
That is the thing with the Ottomans, and we're looking at them in this context, but if you were to zoom out even further, they truly didn't stop. It is remarkable the amount of territory the Ottomans were able to take. We're talking about, at the height of the Ottoman Empire, a very good chunk, I'd say almost all of the sort of Muslim world at this point, not the entirety, but, you know, a very high percentage of it, and then a good chunk of territory into Europe. We're talking about the Ottomans being the masters of the Balkans at one point. Now, they got stopped at a certain point in sort of your northern Balkans into Eastern Europe, but yeah, it's amazing the amount of territory that the Ottomans controlled.
Too little, too late help of European crusader armies that disintegrated on impact, it was clear the show was wrapping up. By 1453, Sultan Mehmet finally had the means to take the city of Constantinople, and by means, I mean cannons the size of a house. After blockading the Bosphorus and cutting off the city's line of supply, the Ottomans blasted open the Theodosian walls and poured in. Emperor Constantine is said
the Theodosian walls! They lasted oh so long, but even the best walls must fall eventually.
Have given a rousing speech to his countrymen before charging into where the fighting was fiercest, never to be seen again.
Yeah.
After the battle, the Sultan toured the city and was so awed by the beauty of Hagia Sophia that he preserved it and converted it into a mosque, rather than blasting it and starting from scratch, as was more often the move.
Yeah.
But even after this, he said, moving the goalpost back for dramatic...
Yeah, even after this, it survived in some way. This, you know, even before this is a little shaky. After the fall of Constantinople, you're getting on some really shaky ground if you want to talk about the continued existence of the Byzantine Empire, right? But, you know, we sort of dwell in these technicalities. But what they're talking about here, now, of course, a good chunk of that Byzantine architecture was destroyed or lost or whatever, but if you go to Istanbul today, some of it still survives, because it truly was remarkable. And the Ottomans saw that, and so a lot of it they repurposed for their own means, right?
Effect, it wasn't the end for the Byzantines. For one, the Ottomans continued the time-honored love of ultra-domed architecture, but also the Venetian Republic's outlying territories in the Aegean and Ionian Seas were majority Greek, further preserving Hellenic culture for centuries. Venetian Crete...
Oh yeah, and I mean, that Hellenic culture was preserved, well, until now, right? I mean, we have the development of a Greek nation-state in the 1800s, and then that sort of becomes the standard bearer for Hellenic culture and history. But that Hellenic culture, that Greek culture and history, you know, Orthodox Christianity, well, all of that survives. And of course, Orthodox Christianity has spread wide and far, you know, far beyond Greece or far beyond the Byzantine Empire at that point. But yeah, a lot of that influence survives in one way or another.
A beacon for art and scholarship that mixed the Italian Renaissance with traditional Hellenism. So despite the earth-shattering treachery of crusading Venetians, the painfully ironic end result is that Venice played a vital part in the long-term preservation of Byzantine culture.
Well, we saw Venice, it never disliked Byzantine culture. In fact, it might have liked it a little bit too much. Copying its art and architecture, stealing a lot of its art, you know, stealing some of its artifacts. Yeah, it clearly liked that Byzantine art, culture, and architecture, so I guess once the empire is gone, well, here you go, Venice, now is your time to preserve some of this. And of course, within the Ottoman Empire, now of course this was a Muslim empire, right? And if you were non-Muslim, if you were Jewish, if you were Christian, you didn't necessarily have the same rights. Though compared to some Christian states of the era, there was a higher degree of tolerance. Now, that's not a high bar to pass today, but at the time, tolerance was extremely uncommon, so any degree of tolerance was pretty rare. And so these communities continued existing within the Ottoman Empire, and to some extent, they maintained their traditional culture and history and ideology and identity, to some extent, right? A lot of that fades over time, a lot of it's replaced, etc., etc. It's a very complicated thing to talk about, but some of this is preserved within the Ottoman Empire.
Man, that is uncomfortable to say out loud. And though Crete fell to the Ottomans in 1669, nice, the Ionian Islands remained stubbornly non-Ottoman until they became part of modern Greece.
Yeah.
But that is really pushing the timeline, so let's wrap up. The standard question of the Byzantine Empire is essentially, why didn't they die way the hell sooner when everything was always on fire?
True.
Because on one level, yeah, the Byzantine story is over 1,000 straight years of the map.
It is honestly truly remarkable. When we look at Rome as a whole, Western Rome does manage to survive for a long time, but it does eventually fall. And then the East survives for another 1,000 years. Truly amazing. I think it has something to do with that adaptability, that ability to change over time, to change your tactics, change how you engage with the world. I reckon that's gotta be the key.
Getting smaller, but that time lapse would have been swift if they didn't persevere. Let's not forget they had over 1,000 years. By some metrics, that's the longest empire, and it got that far because at no point in Byzantine history was it too late to care or too late to try. Because
Yeah.
they believed that they had something about
Yeah, they
their
kept trying to fight, they kept trying to adapt until the very end.
state, their people, their faith, and their identity that was worth living for and dying for. And even when the last mini golden age was a distant memory, that tireless determination to do their best kept them going.
I do love this list of revivals. It's almost, a bit melancholy in that, these revivals, all very impressive in one way or another, but it's like each revival is like smaller than the last. We're talking about Justinian's reconquest. My goodness, we're reconquering a good chunk of the entire Roman Empire. By the time we get to the end, it's like, well, we're taking some of Anatolia and some of Greece and some of the islands back. Yeah, it's all contextual, right? It depends on what era you're looking at. Retaking some of that territory around this time could be very impressive, but just looking at them all together, you really see that sort of decline over time, even when the empire's doing relatively well.
In even the most dire circumstances to create the next mini golden age. So when we look back at the empire to ask why the Byzantines kept going after Rome falls in 476, it's for the same reason as when Constantinople fell in 1204, but those Byzantines kept going.
Yeah?
Thank you so much for watching. This video was an absolute joy to make, even though I had...
It was a joy to watch and give my commentary on. I enjoyed this series a lot. I always like doing some Byzantine content. These videos are very interesting. We had beginnings, the Golden Age, and the fall. You could categorize Byzantine history in a lot of different ways. Periodize it in a lot of different ways. But, a three-part series, this is a perfectly good way to do it. And I enjoyed this. I think the Byzantine Empire is fascinating, how it survived for such a long time, how it was in almost constant decline, but continued to survive until it didn't, of course, how it adapted. Its role in the world changed, but, even though at times it didn't want to accept a lessened role, it did, right? It developed new tactics to deal with its new role in the world, its new role amongst its neighbors, some of which were becoming very powerful. We've had a lot of competitors over time. The Byzantines had issues with the Bulgarians, the Venetians, Genoa, the Normans, well, of course, all of these Latin Christians with the Crusades, the Church, the Western Church, they had a lot of issues with themselves, several caliphates, the Seljuk Turks, the Ottomans. It's remarkable all of these different polities that the Byzantine Empire had to deal with and find different and new ways of dealing with them and not dying until we get to the Ottomans, who truly bring it to an end. I really enjoyed this series. I hope you guys did. And if you did, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Any of those good things. Now that we're done with that, with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.